Alrighty, so you are here, as you just heard, on KPCA 103.3 in Petaluma, California, and you are listening to State of the Union with DG the 30-something, and I'm going to give my little spiel before we start. So I am really excited to offer opportunities for the local candidates to speak about issues facing Petaluma. It's a little bit of different from my normal show, but not too much. So, and I really encourage people to check the full schedule at kpca.fm because we have programmers that are also interviewing candidates and then interviewing school board candidates. And so there's kind of, and in general, check out the kpca.fm website for that full schedule. So, of course, what I express here does not reflect the opinions of PCA or its members. I will not be making any political endorsements over the air. So the second half of the show will be open for public questions. So you can email questions to DOMAYNE@maberme.com. You can also ask them via phone at 707-981-7577. Or if you're watching on Facebook, of course, you can see them on the DG the 30-something. You can ask questions there. So my content producer is Melissa. So if you call or ask questions, she will be answering the phone. So I've said every show will be nice. And so for the purposes of these interviews, and it's been consistent, I'd like to keep the questions that address the future issues or the current issues in Petaluma, and I'd like to stay away from questions regarding political affiliation, voter history, or the like, because this is a nonpartisan election. And all the questions will be asked anonymously for consistency. So I am going to get into it, and I'm going to let the candidate that is sitting here introduce themselves.
Okay, well, I'm Dave King. Thanks for having me. I'm running for re-election here in 2018, and I've got your list of questions, and the first one says personal introduction, so I will personally introduce myself. As I said, I'm Dave, and I've lived here in Petaluma for 27 years. My wife and I moved here from San Francisco in 1991. We've raised both our daughters here. They are grown. One is 28, Caroline, known as Carrie, and the other is 21-year-old Katie, who's in college. And I also have a business downtown. It's a law office. I'm a sole proprietor, and I've been working downtown since the early 1990s. After moving my practice here from San Francisco. And I specialize in employment law, mostly discrimination, retaliation, and harassment cases, the civil rights of employment, representing employees mostly and some small employers. Prior to being on the council, I coached girls softball and girls basketball and some soccer, mostly girls, although one co-ed team. Over the course of 16 years, and I worked for several nonprofits as a volunteer on their boards, Petaluma People Services Center, the Petaluma Area Chamber of Commerce, Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Sonoma County, and also served on the Youth Commission. And since being on City Council, I've served also a term or a year on the Youth Commission, the Planning Commission, and 2 sessions on Parks and Rec, as well as 2 years on the Sonoma Clean Power Board. And now I'm currently serving as Petaluma's representative on the County Water Advisory Committee. So that's my personal background, and in a nutshell. And your next question, if you want me to go through your list of questions.
I will ask the questions.
All right, perfect.
I will ask you the questions.
How we're going to do this, and you can go ahead.
Yes, I appreciate you being prepared, but
Yeah.
I will ask the questions. So what policies, strategies, or the like do you propose to manage the rapid growth in Petaluma while preserving the small town and historic charm? And I was asked during my first interview what I consider rapid growth. And so I would say within the last 15 to 20 years.
Okay. Well, I think we probably all have our definitions of rapid. It's a fair question. Well, first of all, we have an urban growth boundary that's been in place since 1998. I supported it then. I support it now. It got renewed probably about 10 years ago with the advent of the new or current general plan, and it will carry through to 2025. I'd like to see the council probably move forward with, probably toward the end of the next 4 years, looking to build a new general plan that's going to succeed the 2025 plan, and expand not the boundary itself, but the number of years that it would cover, probably another 15. I think the urban growth boundary has worked very well for Petaluma. It has reduced sprawl development, which is very inefficient, and also I think that it's very important to understand that having a definitive boundary helps define a community rather than become a sprawling entity that sprawls into the next city and the next city and the next city. A city can lose its identity that way. Petaluma has a very strong green belt, both in the south and in the east and west, and to a large degree in the north, and I'd like to keep that going. So that's one thing. We are going to grow. One thing that is certain, we're not going to have no growth, but we're going to have some growth, and the question is how. Right now, we're doing a fair amount of infill building. When I say we, I mean the developers that have come to the city and received their permits over the last 15 or so years. There's a fair amount of apartment building being constructed right now for rentals. And one of the things I think that the city is going to need to look at is its current height restrictions in certain areas so that we can build up a little bit instead of building out. Petaluma is an extremely desirable place to live, and it has been for many, many years. The wave of people that have come in recently is just the recent wave. There have been waves of people coming in from San Francisco, Marin County for decades, and it's because Petaluma is, relatively speaking, affordable. Not so much as it used to be, but relatively speaking compared to those other areas, and a very desirable, beautiful place to live. And so we're still going to have people coming here. We do need to deal with our traffic congestion. I support steps to build the Rainier Crosstown connector as well as the Caulfield connector. The reality of that is those are both fairly expensive projects, and we're going to need money to do it. We have some money in our traffic mitigation fund to start some of the steps on Rainier, but we're a long way from having the money to construct the whole project, and I think it's going to be done in segments. But we certainly need more than one major road that goes across town in a city of 60,000 plus people. And so I think traffic relief is going to be very important to keep that downtown feel. We've had in the past 10, 15 years some significant growth in the downtown in terms of the creation of Theater Square and the extension of downtown, replacing a bunch of empty lots and old car dealerships, which I think is a tremendous improvement to the city. And prior city councils that fostered that should be credited for that. I think that we're going to have, if we do get the grant money, the ability to do a road calming on Petaluma Boulevard South, which will make it more pedestrian and bike friendly, and I think the traffic will actually flow just as well, if not better, with the turn lanes. And it will get repaved, which is needed, and most of the money will come from a source other than the city of Petaluma. So the other thing that we'll do is it has the potential to continue to expand downtown in that direction as it is trying to do to expand north of Washington Street, so that it gets to be larger. And in terms of the biggest problem is making sure that people from all over the city can get to downtown and enjoy it when we're talking about downtown. As far as the rest of small town feel, I think that pretty well covers it.
Alrighty, so let's move on to the next. So what additional issue not addressed above is high on your list if elected back into office?
Well, there's several. One is our affordable housing program. The City Council has this month finalized an amendment to the inclusionary housing ordinance, that will require developers to build 15% of their units in the inclusionary category, which includes affordable and workforce housing. And if they choose not to, the law requires them to have a choice to pay a fee. However, the fee now will be in excess of the cost of building the housing. So there is a substantial incentive to the developer to build the housing on site, which will create some affordable housing in town, I believe, as development comes through. We really haven't had an active affordable housing program where new housing had been built in the last 6 years since the loss of the redevelopment money that we had received from the state of California that was pulled back in the early 2010s. And although Petaluma was an extreme leader in that area when we had redevelopment, we have lagged, as I imagine almost every other city in the region. We have about 21 or 2,200 units, apartments, homes that are considered affordable housing, but we do need to add to that stock, and I think that's significant. And I think we need to address affordable housing going forward, and looking at some creative ways to get some smaller units built that are a little more affordable to buy and rent. So I think that's an important project. We also have to deal with what's happening with our public safety, both fire and police. We are down probably 8 to 10 police officers, probably more if you include the number of officers who are on disability. We could use more firefighters as well. And in addition, probably equally important is their facilities, by and large, are substandard and need some tender loving care in the form of revenue. So we may have to look at doing some type of revenue tax, propose it for a vote to the citizens to see if they're willing to pay for some of these public safety improvements which are needed. We about 15, 16 years ago, we lost on a regular basis police officers after they were trained here, and what I'm informed is that's starting to happen now, and it's a real problem both for fire and police, and it's something that really needs to be addressed by the council going forward. So those are two things that come to mind that I haven't touched upon.
Alrighty. So, given the upcoming general plan updates, you've already mentioned the four. Where do you see Petaluma in 10 to 15 years?
Well, generally in the same geographic location it currently is, but I think Petaluma will grow slowly. We'll continue to have a strong and expanding downtown. Like I said, I think that the one option for its growth will be a minor change in the height restrictions. I have always supported and will continue to support efforts to keep businesses that employ people in town here, because I think that's a big factor for a variety of reasons. It gets people off the road, it saves them an enormous amount of time, and people who work in Petaluma or nearby have a much better chance of participating in the life of the city because they're not spending hours on the road. I was knocking on doors this afternoon campaigning, and I talked to a woman over on, drawing a blank on what street, I think it was Pinewood Court, and she mentioned that her commute is 2 hours each way to Daly City to teach. And the more people that can avoid that type of commute, the better. So we need to continue to work to build businesses that hire and pay good wages so that people that live here can work here. And I think that's important. I think we're doing that through our economic development department in business retention and attraction. And I think that those efforts should continue. And I think right now, I think I read recently that 38% of the people who are workers in Petaluma, work in Petaluma that live here. It would be good to increase that percentage to a higher number. It seems like an okay percentage given the number of people that actually commute both in the county and south and east. However, it'd be nice to get that up. So that's kind of where I see the city in 10 years. I'd also like to see our parks be vastly improved. We really don't have much of a park budget, and I'll put a plug in for Yes on Measure M, which is the county 1/8 of a cent tax measure to help park maintenance and construction. Petaluma would get $600,000 a year, and the county parks would certainly get a big boost. So hopefully people will look at that in a very positive way and consider voting for it, because it's needed here in Petaluma.
Alrighty, so before we get into the second half, is there any additional comments you'd like to add?
Well, no, I think I've covered a wide range of topics. I'm sure there are more to be covered, but if you have questions from the audience, that would be great.
Surely. So, I think there's a major concern that Petaluma is going to turn into Marin County. We know, I think it's over 50%, if not more, of the employees in Marin County commute. And you kind of touched on it, but I think the main question is how do larger companies, still small business, but larger companies, how can those be attractive given the really limited space in Petaluma to hire people?
Well, I think, and I'm not 100% sure if this is perfectly accurate, but I think our commercial space here in Petaluma is generally less expensive than commercial space in Marin County, which is what businesses look for when they relocate. They look for a lot of things. They look for a good workforce. They look for relatively inexpensive space to have their businesses be situated. And I think we have pulled businesses from Marin over the years, probably more so than go the other direction. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to pull too many businesses up from the Bay Area, depending on what type of business they are. But there's certainly efforts made by the city government through the Economic Development Director, which is a fully funded position at City Hall, to attract businesses. The retention program is very helpful too, which is part of that, which is that businesses, if they have an issue that is government-based or city government-based, they can contact a specific individual at City Hall. If the problem is fixable, that can be done, and that has been done, to my understanding, over the last 7 to 8 years since this position's been funded. But I think that's how we attract those businesses. Hopefully that answers the question.
Sure. So, for me, I have a Petaluma-based company, and I was very excited to have a downtown-based company after they're on for 6 years. But one of my major issues with having an office downtown is that it's a great location, but my clients, my sub-consultants, they can't park. And I know that that's a common issue, but I'm just wondering what a potential solution is to that.
Well, I don't know if there's one silver bullet. The construction of a large public parking structure certainly would help. I'm not sure how it would be funded. It would probably be funded in conjunction with maybe the downtown. But downtown parking is a problem. We have more people working downtown, which is a good problem to have. We have more people coming downtown to eat and go to the businesses, which is a good problem to have, but people drive. So there can be efforts to get people to walk who live relatively close, and I think that's happening. People that might have driven downtown 10 years ago that perhaps live a half mile, 3/4 of a mile away are now walking instead. We can improve bike access, perhaps put some more places where bikes can be stored downtown. But it is a tough problem because there's not a lot of space for anything, and most of the land that is available is privately held. And I'm not so sure that a privately held lot is going to be made available for a multi-story parking garage. So it's something that we have to grapple with. Some options could be, and it's really more creative, is if businesses could lease some of their parking at night, but night is probably less of a problem than during the day, to be candid. Having been down there both night and day with some regularity, I think the daytime parking can be very daunting.
Well, and this is a really interesting point that's come up, is that the Petaluma Hotel pays a very small amount to have 30 parking spots in the Keller Street garage, which is right where my company is. And I think it's $7,000 to $7,500 a year. And so they're taking 30 spots in our 10-hour parking. And I'm not saying that you necessarily need to answer that direct question, but then how do small companies that are in downtown compete with the fact to park that on the weekend you have 30 spots in 10-hour parking?
Right. Well, it's a
taken
dilemma.
up.
I'm not familiar with that contract, so it's not something that's come up when I was on board that I recall. I may not have ever come to the city council, quite frankly. It's not everything comes to the city council. That gets decided by the city government. In fact, the day-to-day operations are run by the city manager and staff, and there are many things that are not brought to the level of policy, and I would imagine a parking contract probably was not. I really don't, beyond what I said before, we do need to look at solutions, and space is a real problem downtown. I know the Downtown Association is looking into it. Being downtown, I have to be careful. I have the 500-foot rule that applies to me as a council member, and although I'm a candidate too, I have to be careful. I can't really comment on particular projects within 500 feet of my office.
Sure.
By law.
It's not a big radius.
No, it's not a big radius, but there is one particular project that is within 500 feet that
Sure.
I am not going to comment on because I don't think I'm supposed to. I haven't got a clear answer on it, but it is a potential parking solution that's out there, and there are others that have been floated out by the Downtown Association. And I think the Downtown Association, working with the city, may be able to find some parking.
Well, I guess I wonder what kind of influence the Downtown Association actually has in city government. I'm asking that because I have no idea.
Well, as much as any other entity that petitions city government, I mean, there is support for the Downtown Association from the city, to support the downtown. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's something. So they do have that influence. And getting back to the question you had originally asked about business attraction, not all business attraction, in fact, almost all of the business attraction that happens comes outside of downtown. In the other part of Petaluma, other parts of Petaluma, Redwood Business Park, along South McDowell, the Marina complex, and other locales where businesses are located, hire people, and parking can be an issue in some of these places, but it's not as problematic as downtown. Downtown was originally built and constructed over 100 years ago, and one of the beauties of downtown is that it was built 100 years ago, and it has some spectacular buildings, and it's a lovely place to be. But we have to deal with the fact that it wasn't built for the type of car volume that we have in 2018, or quite frankly, 1990 either.
Yeah, so I guess the other thing that I always find is an interesting paradigm is that the city is often talking about, most recently, that there is very low commercial vacancy. But as a business downtown, I see a lot of turnover, and a lot of turnover. There's certain places that stay, but otherwise there's a lot of turnover. And again, I'm not saying there's a immediate solution, but as someone of my generation, I would like that transparency be shown that there's a very low level, there's a very high level, of commercial vacancy. But there's also a high level of turnover. And so for me personally, I think that's an issue because it is such a high cost to have a downtown business. So, and I know we have our economic development person, but I'm just wondering if there's any option for the city to have an incentive to, a lot of other cities use incentives to attract businesses. And so I'm wondering if there's any ideas about how there can be more of a incentive. When I started my company 6 years ago, of course, it was much cheaper to start a business in Petaluma. But now California, on top of Petaluma, it's very expensive. And almost impossible for someone my age to live here. And so I'm just wondering maybe if there is a potential for any sort of incentive.
Well, there's a couple of issues in your question. First of all, just as someone who's worked and had an office downtown since 1994, in fact, I started out in this very building upstairs and was here for about a year and a half and moved down the street to 17 Keller. I've had a pretty good bird's eye view of downtown and businesses that come and go, and it's been happening since the early 90s, and it's been happening prior to the early 90s from, if you talk to anybody who's been here longer than I have. And so in terms of attracting, those locales generally get filled. A lot of retail comes in, and retail is tough downtown. You really have to have a niche to be able to sell, and those stores, a lot of them don't have a forever shelf life. The people who run them really have to work very hard to keep them going. They have relatively small margins, and at some point they decide to move on from that business. There are many businesses that have stayed downtown for decades. Copperfield Books being one of the best examples, but there are others. Leone has been there for a very long time. There are others. I don't mean to leave out the many of the other businesses that come and go. Then you mentioned, the cost of housing here, and I think that's largely due to the market in the Bay Area, which is spread throughout the entirety of the Bay Area, relative to San Francisco, which is where we get some of our people, and relative to Marin County. Petaluma, which is very expensive, is less expensive. So the market is something that is going to rise and fall depending on the buyers. I mean, right now I understand that it's slowing down a bit, if not, stopping and retreating, which I think is a good thing. Too red hot of a market is not good for people trying to come in and live here.
So I've asked this question, I think, in almost every interview I've had, and my background's in public health, so I know a lot about the demographics in the city. And so where I grew up on the east side, in that census tract, it's actually one of the poorest and also has the lowest life expectancy, because we know place matters, compared to Cherry Valley. And so it's kind of this conversation about the east-west divide. As someone, I know not everyone believes in it, but as someone that grew up on the east side and then moved to the west side, I think that there is a vast difference between the sides. And now I live in a pretty well-off census tract, and it was very different from where I grew up. And so how do we start to bridge that gap? And I think a lot of it actually has to do with involvement. Like, how do we get that side, I hate to say it's one side or the other, but how do we unite the city and to get more people involved?
Well, I think one way would be to stop talking about sides of town as a defining line. It's not an insult to your question, but I think it's a start. I think people on the east side that live there, it's a large part of town. It's probably 2/3 of the town in terms of population, 2/3 of the town in terms of area. So the neighborhoods on the east side vary significantly. There are neighborhoods on the east side that I would suggest would be some of the nicer places to live in Petaluma. And I agree that there are sides on both sides of town that are not as nice as some of those neighborhoods are in terms of wealth and income. I think it's a broader question in terms of the public health aspect of things. I think that's a broader question than what's going to be dealt with ever at the city council. We really don't deal with a whole lot of public health issues. We have a healthcare district and a hospital and a healthcare network, and there's a public health system that really is what carries the day there. In terms of the question of getting people involved, I think people are involved from all over town. Having served on the boards, people lived all over the city. It isn't just a West Side thing. In kids' sports, You know, I probably mostly coached kids from the east side and had parents who were involved and coached with me, volunteered on the team as team parents, you know, helped with the driving, helped at the practices, helped scoring the book. Um, it, it, the town is less divided in that way than I think sometimes people perceive. That's my sense of it. I think a big part of it is the difficulty for people living on the east side. If you want to come downtown, I've heard this a lot, that they don't because of the traffic right now, and it's been a real problem because for many years, quite frankly, long before my one term on council, we haven't built the infrastructure needed for a city of this size, and we need to do that.
So this is my personal question before I get into others.
Sure.
But so why isn't public health a concern of city council?
It's not, I didn't say it wasn't a concern. It's a personal concern of mine. My daughter just got a master's degree in public health, so I'm learning quite a bit about it. It isn't in our jurisdiction. In the sense of any of the policies that come forward, we actually have a separate government entity called the healthcare district that is charged with dealing with public health. And it isn't that because anyone on the city council doesn't care about the health of the general public. Now, to the degree that you're dealing with emergency preparedness, safety, having a fire department that is properly equipped to get out and make ambulance calls, which is 2/3 of their work, is paramedic work, and working with the hospitals in the region to get people who have had major events. I'm personally aware of how that works from something that happened to a family member of mine. And I think we're involved in providing those resources. But in terms of determining what end of town may have a shorter life expectancy than another end of town, I'm hard pressed to see where the city charter really gets us there, gets us into that type of issue. It is important, I'm not dismissing it, but there are other avenues of the state. The county does an awful lot with public health, and they have jurisdiction. The state has substantial jurisdiction. The federal government has substantial jurisdiction, although currently I think it's asleep, but it does as well. So I know that would be the answer I would give. I mean, our basics are to make sure that city government, which is the Department of Public Works, the fire department, the police department, the city manager's office, the parks, etc., the water department, and I'm probably missing more than the finance and everybody else. I'm probably missing a half a dozen planning as well, operate properly.
Well, and that's really interesting. So you've, of course, we understand the charter of the city and it's kind of separated, but a lot of people feel that, and again, of course, there is the health district, but a lot of people feel like we've lost our hospital in town, Petaluma Valley, because they don't offer a lot of services. Again, it's a completely private entity, but is there a place for the city to advocate for us to have that resource as opposed to having to go to Santa Rosa or San Rafael?
Well, certainly the city, if given a proposal or given an option to expand the hospital, which in the 4 years I've been on has not come forward, I think should, like any agency, should work in relative cooperation with the other agencies. I haven't seen, whether as a citizen or as a council member, much ability to expand. I think right now what most people are concerned with is keeping the hospital that we have, which has an emergency room, and it's very important to have that in Petaluma, otherwise we wouldn't have one. Kaiser, which is a major facility and probably covers the most people in town, I would suggest, does not have an emergency facility here in Petaluma, as all Kaiser patients know. And so it's important, to the city that we do have a hospital. In terms of the city government's role or responsibility, certainly working in some cooperative method with the healthcare district and the hospital is important. So that would be my answer to that.
All right, so I'm going to get into, so I did have a couple public questions here. So, and this has kind of been a popular, I don't know, popular is the way to say it, but it's been a conversation that's been happening. So what is your vision about the fairgrounds?
My vision. Well, I view the fairgrounds as having a multiple step process going forward. The lease is up in 4 or 5 years, $1 a year lease, which was given originally probably 70 plus years ago. It's 54 acres of land, at least. I've heard different numbers, but 54 is the one that sticks in my head, that the city actually owns and is leasing it for $1 a year. The city is going to take back some of that property, and what is done with it is part of a later process. So right now, what's happening is there are discussions with the fair board representatives about keeping the fair, figuring out a way that the fair can stay on a smaller footprint, and where those negotiations are, I don't know. What I would probably advocate if I got reelected, not probably, what I will advocate if I get reelected, is that we have at least 1 or 2 council members on the negotiating committee, because some decision as to that step, and that's just the first step, has to be made. And if there is some kind of accord reached, I see the next step being the public being involved in that analysis of what is tentatively worked out between the fair and the city, because the land is owned by the citizens of the city of Petaluma, not just, by way of the government. It's their decision. So if there's some type of approval of those 2 steps, that the fair takes X or whatever is worked out, and there's a lot of different options there, and the public seems to get behind that. We would have some workshops and meetings about that. That would be the first thing that has to be ironed out, if it can be ironed out. The second step, as I see it, is if the city takes back some land in 5 years, a future city council would have to have a very open process about what we're going to do there. Personally, depending on the amount of land that the city recovers and takes back, I would like to see something, and I may be deciding this, advocating for this as a citizen by that point, because I think it will be in the well into the 2020s, of a convention center or something along those lines, if in fact it pencils out that it can generate money for the city government and also provide a good use for the residents. There are some other options. People have talked about putting some housing on part of it, parkland, and I think the public has to weigh in on all that. There are a lot of options. It's a very unique situation, but that first step really needs to be worked out, because there are people in town who want to keep the fair. I just can't be on 54 acres, in my view, going forward.
So, kind of going a little bit.
And let me,
go ahead.
On 54 acres for $1 a year going forward, I guess would be the way I should actually have completed that sentence.
Okay. So we're going a little bit backwards, but not too far. So, a little bit more of a request on getting people involved. So, we know there's a really low voter turnout for non-presidential elections. And I think it's pretty evident at city council meetings, community town halls, that there are demographics that aren't represented. And so I'm just wondering if there's any strategies or any ideas about how we get the other 50% of Petaluma involved that are over the age of 18.
Well, first of all, it's your basic civic obligation to vote. I mean, that's the minimum a person can do. And on some level, I have a hard time with the idea that you have to incentivize people to do something that really doesn't take that much time. It takes some effort to figure out the issues because there's a lot to vote on. It can be daunting. But voter registration drives that political parties do and others do are important. But getting people to the polls throughout the country, not just in Petaluma, to me is surprisingly low, given that we have a democracy that is not automatic. And we can see in other places in the world where democratic governments go by the wayside for a while for reasons including indifference. In terms of getting people involved in the city, there are many ways you can apply and try to get on commissions and committees. That's one way. But there are a million ways in Petaluma to get involved. If you're not involved, your eyes aren't open. I really think that, I don't mean involved like doing 100 million things, but if you do want to get involved and you have the time, and not everybody can. I mean, let's be realistic. Some people have young kids and they're booked, or people have to take care of elderly parents and they're booked. They commute to work or they have long hours at work and they're booked. But if there's people who want to get involved, they can get involved in the nonprofits, in the various youth activities. And I don't want to necessarily be a commercial for them, but I can lay some of them out for you. You can drive for Meals on Wheels. You can be a mentor for Mentor Me. They generally need at least 150 people. And you can spend time with a kid. There are a million ways to get involved. It doesn't necessarily have to be the city government. And the reality of every city is that the city government is just one piece of it. It's what gets a lot of attention because it's politics and it is government. And people, enough people do pay attention to it. Beyond that, with local issues, I've always said people are more interested in what's going on in Washington that are politically interested, and it kind of trickles down from there to local. Although I do think probably more so than most places, people pay attention to local issues in Petaluma. I would bet, it's hard to quantify, and I don't have any data, but I think a lot of people do pay attention here and do vote. And I think we do have in Sonoma County generally a higher voter percentage than other parts of California and certainly other parts of the country. So if anybody's listening out there or going to be listening to us later on and you're not registered, you can still register to vote and look through the ballot measures. There's always something that affects your life. For example, Prop 6, which is attempting to repeal the gas tax, will pull 25% of your road repair budget out of Petaluma. So if you like the modest amount of road repair we've done in the last few years, that will decline substantially. In addition, the gas tax that was passed last year by the legislature is going to provide $85 million to complete the widening of 101 through Petaluma, and it won't be there, that money, if the gas tax goes away. So that alone should generate an interest in voting. I mentioned Measure M, the parks measure before. If you like parks and you want to get some money for parks, Measure M is there for you to vote for. So there's a lot of things beyond who's on city council, who's the mayor, who's your congressman or congresswoman that to vote on besides that. If you're not that interested in that, there are other issues to tackle.
And I can confirm that the voter turnout in Petaluma is substantially higher than the nation in a lot of parts of California. And I have, if you want to reach out to me, I have the actual data on that, but I don't have it in front of me right at this moment. But it's substantially higher. So we do have a really involved city.
Yeah.
I can say that. So going back to another point. So we talked about the turnover in downtown Petaluma, but what wasn't talked about in this question alludes to is that the Keller Street Garage is city-owned, and I can confirm that.
Yeah, it is.
It's very dirty. It attracts a lot of homeless people, and I hesitate to say that in that way because I'm not the kind of person that's like, I'll get rid of the homeless people. I think that's a whole other issue. But I also think it is a safety issue. So me as a woman, I don't feel comfortable anymore walking from my office late at night to the Keller Street garage to park. I don't park there anymore at night. And that is a city-owned garage. So I don't think there's a simple solution. I know there's not a lot of police officers that are staffed, but at the same time, I mean, how do you address that major city-owned parking lot in downtown Petaluma?
Well, I will say that it has its issues. There's no question. It has its issues with cleanliness and maintenance, and that's, largely a finance issue for the city. There have been some cameras put in and taken out and put back in to try to at least assist the police if there is crime. In terms of people who are homeless spending time there or sleeping there, that is an issue that goes not just in downtown, although downtown certainly has that as an issue, but in the creeks and river and elsewhere around town. It's something that has increased substantially throughout the entirety of the city. And, the city could address more resources to it. I'm not sure where the funding would come from. We really are in a financial crisis here in the city. Our pension liability and the obligation to pay CalPERS has increased since I've been on the council. It's not something that I did, but it's something that has happened throughout the state of California. That's money that comes directly from our general fund, and our general fund is probably where the money would be coming from. I'm not clear on what other funds would be available for a downtown garage beyond the general fund to cover that. So, yes, I agree that the Keller Street garage could use some attention, including some safety, and that does get back to police. Now, you're not going to have a police officer stationed there 24 hours or even overnight necessarily, but it would, with having a better police presence, a larger police presence downtown, would be helpful. And we do have a police presence downtown, particularly on Friday and Saturday nights, late those Friday and Saturday nights. But it's hard to cover the city when you're down as many officers as our police department is, and there's no easy answer to that, unfortunately.
I agree. There's never an easy answer to really anything, right? So next up, youth programs. So way back when I was one of the founding members of the Petaluma Teen Council before it was called the Youth Commission, a long time ago. But we had a teen center, not at the fairgrounds, but right across the street. And I learned a lot from being there. And I am wondering how not only do we capture the teens in a functional way, but how do we, so let me just say, that taught me how to be civically engaged, because we answered directly to the city council. And so, even further than that, how can we provide services to youth to not just be involved, but to have something to do?
That's a good question. I mean, a lot of that would come through the Park and Rec department, and we do have programs that are directed to all kids, not just teens, and many participate in them. We do have a youth commission, which is fairly large. We just expanded it a couple of years ago. In fact, I think it expanded the year I was the liaison. So that would have been 2017 if I've got my years right. So we do have a fairly large youth commission. One of the things about the youth commission and getting them engaged is their primary relator in terms of government is the school. By the time they get to be in high school, they've been in school for a long time, and they participated in school activities, so they have a very school-centric approach to government. And part of what goes on at the Youth Commission and part of the learning process is learning a bit about how the city government works, which they learn is a separate entity. We don't have control of the schools don't have control of the city. So that's one way. Through the youth commission, the city can be involved, and there's interaction between the schools and the city in that respect. A lot of the programs that the youth commission has are school based. Job fairs and things like that happen at the two high schools. So that's one way, and it's happening. In terms of the broader methods, teens are probably going to participate more in school activities than they are in city activities, just based on my observation, having had two and having, been around their peers and seeing where they spent their productive time. And a lot of that was in the schools. And the city, I think, should continue to have teen centers to the degree that we can afford to have those, youth programs and teen programs, as well as the youth commission.
So just because you mentioned it, just so the audience knows, can you speak to just the age group and the requirements of being on the youth commission, and maybe while you were there, kind of what they were talking about? Just because I think it is a commission, I think a lot of the commissions and committees aren't really well understood, but if you could just speak to that one.
I think you can be 7th grade or above, I think is where the cutoff is, although in truth I think most of the kids are at least in high school, so 9th grade, where the 9th grade or older were the majority of the kids. When I was there, it was largely CASA kids. I think now it's largely Petaluma, which is an interesting thing because recruitment is part of it, and recruitment is in a lot of ways done by word of mouth, and so sometimes high school really tends to dominate. When I was on the commission as a commissioner in the early 2000s, it was like that as well, although we had a pretty good mix, and including some kids from St. Vincent's, which are important. That's a decent sized high school as well. In terms of what they were doing, one of the things I tried to get them to do was really focus on making policy for kids. Coming down to the city council and saying, we want this, we want that, or this is a problem we want to see addressed. I don't know if they ever got there on anything significant, but they were moving in that direction. So we had things like, we brought in Senator Bill Dodd. I started working on that when I was the commissioner, and I think, again, I'm losing track of the years here, but I think that he came in early in the next term. I wasn't on the liaison when he came, and he spoke to them about state government, and it was a pretty well attended event. They've done things like paint, do park improvements. They go to a park. I know we painted the benches at part of Bond Park one year, cleaned out and did some weeding and yard work, I think, at other parks throughout the city. They tend to do that once or twice a year. They get involved in job fairs, which are important to kids. It gets them out to talk to businesses and getting businesses involved with hiring kids, and gets people an idea of how to hire. And then they can bring in kids from the school that are not on the commission, that are just kids that are doing whatever they're doing in high school. And so those are some of the things that the youth commission's been doing. I think it'd be great if we could really get them to be less worker bees, which is good. It helps. Than to be people who come forward with ideas that the adults on the city council and the adults in leadership positions throughout the city may not be thinking about, or not thinking about it in the same way that the kids are thinking about.
Well, and that's very much how it was when I was there.
Yeah,
but that's a very intense conversation. And unfortunately, we only have a few more minutes.
Okay.
So I just want to know if you have any closing comments before we sign off.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed the interview. I think the campaign, we've got, if I'm not mistaken, 6 weeks left to Election Day, and people are going to start voting in about 2 weeks, give or take. I would encourage everybody to get involved. I think every candidate has a website. You can take a look at who they are, what they put on and emphasize on their websites, who's endorsed them. I'm the only incumbent, so I'm the only one who has a record that has to be talked about directly. So I will be doing that. We have 3 forums coming up. I don't have the dates memorized, but they're probably, actually they're on my Facebook page, so somebody posted them on my Facebook page. They're coming up in October, and they're all kind of bunched together. I think it's the 2nd, the 9th, and the 13th.
Yeah, 2nd and the 9th, yeah.
And one's on a Saturday afternoon at the library, and one's at the Hotel Petaluma, and one's at City Hall. And the mayor's race, the mayors will be at each of those, so they will, or the mayoral candidates, not the mayors. The mayor may be there too, but the mayoral candidates will have their own separate forms, some at the same time as council. So if you want to be involved, or at least see what's going on in the campaigns, there's a lot of ways to do it. And most of us are walking door to door, so if you get a knock and there's somebody standing there with a flyer, try to be nice, because we're just running for office, not selling you hardware or anything else.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. And I do want to say that I will be airing on election night if you want to hear a little bit more how I feel about this. And I also have to give a plug because it's a national election registration. I think I'm messing up with how it's actually called, but it's the biggest one I plug is vote.org. You can find out your voter status in case you're wondering if you moved recently or where you're registered. Voter Registration Day, that's what it's called. So, yeah, please for sure check that out. If you are not registered or you know people who aren't registered, please encourage them to do so. The next time that I am on, I'm not here on the 2nd, I am here on the 9th with Dennis Posake. I can never pronounce it right. Posake, thank you. He's going to have to teach me how to say it. I've been learning. I'm so sorry. My name's complicated too. So I've been doing it a lot in my life. So he will be here on the 9th. It's actually pre-recorded. So because of the conflicts with the forums. But please, if you have questions for him, submit them prior to myself or him, because he'll bring them in the studio. As I always say, that if you miss part of this or you know someone that wants to hear in, the videos, they're all up to date right now on my website. They are domenica.ninja. You can get the videos there. I also have the contact information for each candidate. Please direct your questions from this point on to them. And then if you have any questions for me, I'm very accessible and my office is always open, my office door. So thank you so much. You are listening to KPCA LP at 103.3. And if you're on video, you're watching it there. Again, you are with Deji, the 30-something on State of the Union. See you next time.